Today's webinar is Demystifying Accessible Design, How to Apply WCAG 2.2. My name is Bethany Servin, and I work in marketing here at UsableNet. So our first speaker today is Jason Taylor. He's our Chief Innovation Strategist and Advisor to the UsableNet CEO. And I'm going to actually go ahead and hand you off to Jason now to get us started.
Hi, Bethany. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Real pleasure that we have Luca Boskin with us today. He heads up our UX and user research division at UsableNet. He is a participant in putting together UX training for a number of our teams, and he also produces a number of great free content pieces. I have Bethany to put a link to a couple of those in the chat window for people to consume after this. Luca's going to basically take us through a number of areas. If you can move on to the agenda slide. Just a little bit about UsableNet. Essentially, we've been around for 20 years. We help companies make sure that they're creating accessible digital experiences. UX and design is becoming a significant part of that, especially moving accessibility left. And we try to encourage and help our clients do as best possible accessibility in the design phase. And essentially, this webinar, we hope, will bring into focus the new updates in WCAG 2.2. Really from a design perspective, Luca's going to talk us through. One, he's going to basically cover us and just make sure we're all on the same page about what is the WCAG, what is it trying to achieve, but then really and talking about the sort of four main sort of principles that the WCAG tries to cover. But as important, he's going to really focus down on the WCAG 2.2, what's been added, examples of that. And essentially, he's going to actually show you design examples and talk about the design components that you might be need to consider. And also, he will touch on how to test and remediate things that that already exist. And then we're going to have a live Q&A with him at the end. So with no further ado, I really want to hand it over to Luca to sort of take us through most of the content today.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So hello, everyone. And before we start talking about the latest version of the WCAG 2.2 today, let's quickly review also the relationship between accessibility and usability, and as well also let's review the four types of disabilities or categories of disabilities that affect our users on the web as well, and the challenges they present from the design point of view. So let's first of all address those two terms, accessibility and usability. So when we talk about accessibility really aims at making sure our interfaces and technology work for people with clinically recognized disabilities. So to simplify even further, accessibility is about making sure users or user groups using a different interaction channel can access to the same interface or use the same information. So for example, a blind user using a screen reader will get an auditory representation of the interface. Usability, instead, to quote Jacob Nielsen, is a question of, can people learn the interface? Can they understand it? And can they operate it efficiently? And so in a way, you can see accessibility as one of the parameters for measuring the overall usability of your product or your site. And so if you think about it, you can have a completely accessible website from the coding and the technical point of view, which can, however, still lack a high level of usability, because maybe it addresses the wrong user needs and expectations, maybe is too hard to use, and therefore maybe users will not be able to use its features. And so let's have a look at some examples of how accessible design principles can be applied to everyday life. And the first example I want to show you are essentially curb cuts. So when they were first introduced around the 1940s in the US, they were initially designed specifically for wheelchair riders, but it became immediately clear they were an essential object of urban design for people pushing strollers, elderly people using walk. They became so popular that we now essentially a fix designed for a particular disadvantaged group of people ends up having helpful ramifications for a huge group of people. And then what about the web? So think about responsive web design and responsive websites. So responsive web design as a design process is actually a great example of accessible design. So responsive web design has revolutionized the way we design for the web. It has made websites not just more future-friendly, but has enormously improved the overall people experience on the web, addressing two important user needs and expectations. The first one is that people want to access to content any way they want it. And secondly, people want a seamless experience across all their devices. And so it's important to understand that these two user needs and expectations involves all types of user groups. So including those who are affected by some kind of disability. So what does the term disability really mean? And I'm going to give you the definition from the World Health Organization, which essentially states that there are three dimensions of disability, which are impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. So let's start with an impairment. An impairment is a problem in body function or structure. An impairment may lead to an activity limitation, which is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or an action. And as a consequence of an activity limitation, someone may come across a participation restriction, which is a problem experienced by an individual in involvements in life situations. And so there are essentially four main areas of disabilities that affect our users on the web. And those are visual impairments, auditory, motor, and cognitive. However, keep in mind that most of the time, in the reality, users may be affected by a combination of different conditions that come from these four categories. So let's quickly analyze each one of those, starting with visual impairment. So a huge range of disabilities involve eyesight. Problems with eyesight aren't just related to the function of our eyes, but also how our brain perceives what we see through our eyes. And so all those conditions like nearsightedness, farsightedness, astigmatism, or colorblindness are actually very common in people of all ages. And so the main design consideration when it comes to addressing visual impairments are that visual impairments, of course, affect everything we see on the web. And so users can benefit from considered text sizes, good typography, and well-structured layouts. Also, the use of color is important in terms of maintaining a good contrast of text content and interactive elements. Then think about keyboard users or users using voice recognition. So those users strongly rely on the focus indicator. And so it's important that the focus state of an interactive element is always clear and unambiguous on a screen. And finally, think about changes on a page. So changes on a page need to provide useful feedback, not only visually, but also to, for example, users accessing the page with a screen reader. Then we have auditory impairment. And when it comes to auditory impairment, we essentially distinguish between conductive hearing loss which is caused by a blockage or abnormality in the ear that prevents the sound from getting into the inner part of the ear, and sensory neural hearing loss, which is instead caused by a damage to the nerves of the ear, so distorting sound and making speech harder to understand. Many people use, with hearing loss, use written and spoken language to communicate, like, for example, they use email or messaging to share communication. But for example, rich media content like audio and video content can be inaccessible if alternative ways of accessing this content aren't provided, like transcripts or subtitles, for example. Then, in terms of motor impairments, there is a broad range of conditions that cause motor impairment, like cerebral palsy, neural tube defects, muscle and joint conditions like muscular dystrophy or arthritis, traumatic brain and spine injuries, and also physical labor and repetitive movements can lead to strain injury and other musculoskeletal disorders. And from the design point of view, probably the most important consideration is to keep your designs flexible when it comes to addressing motor impairments, because don't try to bind your designs to exact coordinates and fixed positioning, because they will break easily as soon as users start adjusting them with browser controls or increasing the font size using, again, the browser features for that. And also support alternative ways of interaction. So motor impairments can make the use of standard inputs and outputs pretty challenging. And so people may struggle to use a mouse, a keyboard, or a touchpad based on their physical condition and motor control of their arms, hands, and fingers. And so also interactions that require a dragging interaction or a swipe gesture must be supported with a simpler alternative like a single tap or a single press interaction. And finally, let's quickly review cognitive impairment. So cognitive difficulties are actually incredibly diverse, and the issues or problems that are particularly relevant on a web are motory related, so any difficulties remembering tasks one is trying to accomplish, or just simply where someone is within the site. Attention related, so difficulty focusing on a large amount of information or any type of information for a prolonged period of time. Problem-solving issues like problems processing information, in particular, if the content on the page is not what's expected from the user. Then we have text processing problems, math processing, like understanding mathematical concepts and symbols, like distinguishing quantities, money, or pricing, and also visual processing problems, like difficulties interpreting visual information or understanding visual representations of real-world objects like icons or pictograms. And also among cognitive disabilities, we also include learning disabilities, and we use the term dyslexia as a general term for disorders that result in difficulty in learning to read or interpret words, letters, and other symbols. And also literacy falls into the category of cognitive impairments. In fact, low levels of literacy, in fact, are very common for users who may not have native familiarity with the default language of your site. And then also vestibular disorders and seizures often manifest as motion sensitivity on the web. And so from the design point of view, the main design considerations here are usually to avoid cluttered layouts, first of all, so present only content that is relevant to your users and use a logic order and sequence for presenting this type of content. Applying good typography and iconography, so apply legible fonts that are suitable for UI purposes and use highly recognizable icons. And finally, also simplify your language to make it understandable and clear for the vast majority of users, but in particular for those who may be struggling with literacy problems. And so after this very brief introduction, let's take a look at the new success criteria introduced by the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. The goal of the WCAG, which are maintained by the Worldwide Web Consortium, or W3C, is to offer a single shared standard for web accessibility. And as of October the 5th of this year, the version 2.2 of the guidelines has become the recommended standard. And so on this slide here, there is the complete list of the 9 new success criteria. And the main focus of the 2.2 version is mainly around improving the user's navigation and content finding, improving the way users interact with the interface, making websites in general more predictable, and supporting users and help them make less mistakes. And so today we'll try essentially to unpack this new criteria, and we'll be focusing in particular on those with level A and level AA of conformance, since of course are the most commonly applied. So let's jump into it with the first success criterion, which is the 2.4.11 focus not obscured minimum. And so when we are navigating with a mouse or a trackpad, the pointer on the screen is actually our visual reference showing us where we are on the screen or what we are clicking. But for keyboard users or those users using voice control or switch devices, their visual reference on the screen is actually the focus indicator, which may be represented by an outline of the focused element or a change in color of the same element. And so this success criterion specifically requires the component or the element receiving focus to be at least partially visible on the screen, allowing users to recognize it, first of all, and keep track of where they are on the page. And so I'm going to show you an example of a website failing this criterion. So this is a product detail page of staples.com. And as you can see, right at the bottom of this page here, there is a fixed position or sticky navigation bar, which is supposed to help users quickly navigate to specific page content sections like the details, specifications, reviews, and questions and answers. And the focused indicator on this page here is a 4-pixel black dashed border, which is currently positioned on the quantity selector, which is right on the left-hand side of the red Add to Cart button. So now you'll see the focus indicator moving. Okay, so now pay attention. As you can see, the currently focused element is the Learn More link on the right-hand side of the screen. And then next, the following element receiving focused in the sequence of the tab navigation here is actually hidden behind the sticky navigation bar at the bottom of the page. So you won't be able to see the focus indicator highlighting this element because it is hidden. So if I continue to navigate with keyboard navigation here on a page scroll, as you can see, the first visible element receiving focus is the Standard Protection Plan 2-year option. So as you can see, the No Protection Plan option, which is above the currently focused element, a keyboard user won't be able to see it when it is focused. And this is an example of a page failing this success criterion. So in order to pass this AA rule, the focus indicate, or better, the element receiving focus, in this case, the no protection plan option, should have been at least partially visible on a page. And there is an enhanced alternative to this criterion, which is the 2.4.12, focus not obscured enhanced, which essentially would require this a focused element to be completely visible on the screen while receiving focus. And so for this particular example, the easiest way to make it pass would be to use a CSS property called scroll padding, which essentially, when using keyboard navigation, this CSS property, scroll padding, can help you adjust the offset of the browser scrolling to better focus on elements and move them within your screen's viewing region. All right. The following success criterion we'll be talking about is the 2.4.13 focus appearance. This is actually a AAA, has a AAA level of conformance, but from the design point of view, it's a pretty important one. So focus appearance as a success criterion is closely related to two other existing criteria, which are the 2.4.7 focus visible, which is at level A of conformance and essentially requires that a visible focus indicator exists while a component has keyboard focus. And the other criterion is the 1.4.11 non-text contrast, which is a level AA of conformance, which requires any non-text interactive element or graphical object to have a minimum 3:1 contrast ratio with their surrounding colors. And basically, focus appearance specifies a minimum area for the focus indicator combined with a minimum contrast ratio of that area. So no matter the level of conformance we are targeting, in real life, these three criteria actually complement each other. So we should really be combining them when designing accessible focus indicator, because at the end of the day, our ultimate goal as designers should be to create a user-friendly experience that goes beyond just meeting basic accessibility requirements. And the following example I'm going to show you clearly shows that. So let's go back to our Staples website. And as you have seen from the previous example, our focus indicator here is a 4-pixel thick black dashed border around each interactive element when receiving focus. And this specific focus indicator currently meets this AAA requirement. However, this is not the original focus indicator used on this site here. I have changed it on purpose for this webinar's demo. The original focus indicator used on this site features just a 1-pixel black border, which you will see in a second, and it looks like this. And as you can see visually, the visual difference, it's pretty noticeable. And this example, I guess, really shows you how sometimes just meeting the minimum WCAG requirement doesn't necessarily helps or supports the overall usability of the site. So this success criterion essentially requires the focus indicator to have an area of at least 2-pixel thick perimeter of the element when it's not focused, and to have a minimum 3:1 contrast ratio between the same pixels in the focused and unfocused states. So in this specific case of the Staples site, increasing the original 1-pixel border to just 2 pixels will not make the focus indicator pass this AAA rule. So because of the dashed border. So in order to compensate for the empty gaps of the dashed border, I had to double the original 2-pixel requirement. So the final result would be a 4-pixel black dashed border. Moving on, the following criterion is the 2.5.7 dragging movements. So this criterion requires actions involving dragging movements to support a single pointer alternative. So first, let's define what's a dragging movement. So a dragging movement is any operation when you essentially click on an element on the screen. So the interaction starts with the pointer down event. Then you move it around, for example, following a path on the screen, and then you release it. So the interaction stops with a pointer up event. And so examples of websites failing this success criterion are essentially any websites featuring some sort of Google Maps integration. So here is an example. So as you can see, this is a store locator section when users are supposed to drag around the Los Angeles maps to find the pins of the stores, but there are no single pointer controls for perform the same movements, although there are actually zoom controls that are based on a single press interaction. And another example, which is not based on Google Maps, is the following one. So this is Ticketmaster.com. And this is a map of a concert venue seat map where user can select concert tickets. And so again, as you can see, the user can only drag around the map and zoom in and zoom out, but there are no available single pointer controls for moving the map in all the 4 main directions, so up, down, left, and right. All right, next we have the success criterion 2.5.8 target size minimum. So here we are talking about interactive targets. So whether we are talking about a button, a link, or input control, any target or interactive element should always be large enough so users can easily hit them. And this is important for any users, but in particular those who may be struggling with motor impairments. And technically speaking here, when we are talking about the size of an element, we are referring to its hit area or the bounding box as per WCAG terminology, which is essentially the sum of the element size itself, plus any padding around it, plus any border. And so this criterion essentially defines the minimum size of an interactive element to be at least 24 by 24 pixels. And so, of course, the easiest way to meet this criterion is to design interactive elements that meet this minimum size requirement. Alternatively, we can also have elements that are undersized, so smaller than the minimum requirement, and still make them meet this, this rule as soon as they have sufficient space around them, which still needs to meet the 24 pixel rule. So the way the WCAG measure this spacing is by placing a circle with a 24 pixel diameter right at the center of the bounding box of the element. And so if the circle doesn't intersect any other interactive elements placed next to it, then it is considered a pass. There are some exceptions with this criterion, like if the page, or if you have an undersized element and on the same page there is another element that does the same thing and meets the minimum size requirement that is not needed for the undersized element to change in size. Inline text links are not let's say, don't need to be compliant to this minimum size requirement, default browser controls or unstyled browser controls, and when the target size is considered essential for each presentation. For example, when in a digital map where the pins needs to be placed exactly in a specific place, it is pretty likely that some pins placed next to each other will eventually break the 24 spacing rule. And here is an example of how you can measure your targets on the screen in order to verify if they meet this specific criterion. So for the purpose of this example, I'll be placing a red outline around the links of this page just to show you which is the bounding box of these interactive elements. And then I'll be using a bookmarklet that you can easily find online that essentially changes your mouse cursor into a 24-pixel circle. And so you can see in the top left corner of this page here, I have some social media icons. And so in order to correctly measure their size, I have to place my circle right in the middle of the red bounding box. And this is the correct way of measuring it. In this specific case, I'm going backwards a little bit. So, like here, since the social media icons are left aligned within their bounding boxes, in order to correctly measure this elements against this criterion, I need to place the circle right in the middle of the red rectangle and not at the center of the icon. So those social media icons at the top of the page will be considered a pass for this success criterion. But on the same page, I can show you an example of a fail. So let's go down to the footer section of this landing page. And in the footer, I have a bunch of links. And if I place my circle cursor right in the middle of the shipping link in the second column of my footer links, you can see that the top and the bottom edges of my circle slightly intersect the help/FAQ link on the top and the return link at the bottom. So the easiest way to fix this issue would be to slightly increasing the vertical spacing of my links in order to reach the minimum 24-pixel clearance between each interactive element. The following success criterion we'll be talking about is the 3.2.6 consistent help. That's an easy one to achieve since it's a level A rule. So essentially, users browsing our websites should be able to find help and support in the easiest way possible. And this success criterion ensures exactly this. So users may be looking for help in many different ways, like searching for a frequently asked question page, links to social media, a contact phone number, or a chat. And so if your site supports any of those methods, then their location must be consistent across the site. And this means the location must be consistent both visually as well as for assistive technologies. And for example, including help links, social media links, or any other resources links inside your footer section of the site, it is a really effective way of making sure that users have easy access to assistant regardless of the page they are viewing. And this practice can, of course, greatly improve the user experience by reducing frustration, and increasing the efficiency of finding help resources. Then we have another easy success criterion to pass, which is the 3.3.7 redundant entries. And probably any modern e-commerce website usually already addresses this problem in the correct way. So this success criterion is about making sure our users don't have to enter the same information more than once during the process. And so this is particularly important because it drastically reduces the cognitive load of our users and reduces their chance of making input mistakes while they are manually filling in a form. And so, for example, you know that during a purchase checkout process, users may be asked to provide a shipping and a billing address. And so one of the most popular options we see in use is to provide a sort of checkbox that marks the shipping address as the same address for billing. Then we have other options which may include the possibility of copy-pasting between the shipping and the billing fields, or selecting an address from a drop-down menu, or even pre-populating address fields. Here is another example, for example, where a user can select a radio button to select a desired address, or as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, if the user clicks on a use a different address links, then a new dialog window pops out, and since the application, the website already knows the user, some of the fields are already pre-populated, like the country region field, the first name, and the last name. Also, this success criterion features some exceptions, like when we have to enter the password twice for security as a security check, when the previously provided data is expired, like for example for credit card information, or when the task is considered essential. So for example, if you are designing an online quiz or an online video game that requires a user to answer to specific questions. And finally, the last success criterion we'll be discussing today is the 3.3.8 accessible authentication minimum, which is probably the most complicated one among all the other criteria we have discussed today. So as more and more services are based online, modern websites require users to prove their identity and perform a login process in order to continue their flow or the task they are doing. And this criterion requires any login method to be accessible. And in order to achieve that, it doesn't have to make user remember, transcribe, or solve a puzzle without sufficient help, and alternative methods of authentication must always be available. So let's have a look at the first example. So here we have a pretty simple login form with a username field and a password field. So asking for users' personal information like the name, a phone number, or an email address is okay, as it is considered common information that doesn't change, and users don't have to struggle to recall them. But asking for a username or a password, it is considered a cognitive function test, because because this information can change from site to site, and therefore can be more challenging to remember. So when we ask our users for this type of information, in order to pass this criterion, we have to ensure that we support our users by allowing them, for example, to copy-paste information inside fields, or to use a password manager, for example. And as per this example here, also allowing users to use their email address as an alternative to the username is a very good example of lowering the cognitive load for our users. Then also transcribing data or information is also considered a cognitive function test. And two-factor authentication mechanisms commonly use transcription to make users manually input a verification code into an input field. But of course, not all users can comfortably use this method. And so, in fact, as you know, a verification code may also be received on a different device from the one currently used by the user. So again, to pass this criterion, we have to make sure users can easily copy-paste that information, and also cross-device copy-pasting is considered accessible. Or in alternative, we can, for example, use biometrics to confirm the user's identity, like the use of a fingerprint scan or face recognition. And then we have CAPTCHAs and puzzles. So using only word-based CAPTCHAs with distorted sound, and solving all sorts of puzzle and math equations with no other alternative for users is not considered accessible, because they can create problems for people and increase the cognitive load for completing their tasks. And so the only CAPTCHAs that are considered accessible for this criterion are object recognition CAPTCHAs or personal content recognition, which are not really really common. So where a person uploads their own photos, video, or audio files, and then identifies them from a set of options. So it's also worth remembering that, for example, object recognition cannot be used by users with visual impairments or blind users. So alternative options should still be provided, like sending a magic link after the user have provided an email address. This success criterion has a AAA alternative, which is the success criterion 3.3.9, accessible authentication enhanced, which essentially does not allow the use of object recognition and personal content recognition to be used as cognitive function test. So for the purpose of the AA level of conformance, cognitive function tests can be used to verify users' identity, but needs to support users, and alternatives must always be provided, like, for example, responding to some sort of notification on a second device, or scanning a QR code and then confirming the identity again on a different device, the use of biometrics, so a fingerprint scan or face recognition, password-free authentication methods like magic links, allowing users to use their email address as an equivalent to the username, and finally, the use of hardware authentication devices like USB tokens or YubiKeys. So this was a brief overview of the newly introduced WCAG 2.2 success criteria. So Jason, do you want to wrap up this session with some final thoughts before we take some questions?
Absolutely, Luca. Thank you so much for the detail. Just for everybody, hopefully this is a great amount of content for you guys looking to make sure that you're keeping up to date with 2.2. From a Usability perspective, we have a range of products and services. All of those have now been upgraded to make sure that we can achieve 2.2 for clients, whether that's to include it in audits, to include it in our fully managed service, or to provide training for companies around the subject. I think you'll see basically 2.2 is focused, as Luca said, around really the use of items and trying to make sure people don't make mistakes. And I would say that 2.2 is a sort of a tip towards modern design and how sometimes modern design can create problems for different user groups. So essentially the 2.2 is essentially catching up with essentially modern design. I saw a lot of questions come in, so actually I want to open up the floor to Luca. Just before we do, and I'm going to pass it to Bethany, we will answer every question. So even if you think like, hey, I've got a question, but they're not going to get to it, we will get to it between myself or Luca, primarily probably Luca will answer any question. We'll pull the email that it came from and make sure you get the response. So Bethany, maybe you could lead the Q&A session, picking out design specific questions for Luca.
Hey, yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Luca. So we have got some time for questions. Yeah, we had quite a few come in while we were looking at the slides. So Luca, I don't know if you want to maybe go back to the Staples slide and we can kind of start there. But the first question related to that one is, can you clarify why the 2-pixel dash black line on the Staples website would not pass? And is it the contrast ratio caused by the dash line? Luca, you're on mute if you're speaking now.
Yeah, sorry. So no, it's not related to the contrast ratio. It's more related to the math involved into this success criterion. And if you have a look at a whole page related, the WCAG page related to this success criteria, there are specific examples showing you how you should calculate this. So essentially, this requirement says that you should have a 2-pixel area, a 2-pixel thick border of the area of the element where it is not focused. But if you are using a dash border, that means that the 2-pixel area will not be complete because the missing links will not sum up to the full area of the element you are focusing. And that's why you need to double a dotted or a dash border in order to meet the overall requirement of this rule.
Okay. What determines why someone should aim for AA versus AAA?
Well, this is an industry, the majority of websites, and when we are doing audits and design reviews, the standard is to meet the AA level of compliance, which is the most, let's say, the most used. The AAA level of compliance adds much more restrictions either into the design phase and also in terms of development. And it's usually required by specific projects. So and maybe Jason has some feedback on that, on how which area or segments of the market are really use the AAA requirement as a standard for the digital products. But in general,
sorry, this is Jason. In our experiences, probably mainly for a commercial perspective, AA makes the most amount of sense legally, also user-wise. But if you've got a very big user base of people with disabilities, then AAA makes sense. So I think you need to look at your user base and decide, if we've got a very strong user community which use a lot of assistive technology, then AAA makes sense.
Okay. How can we be sure about the visibility, at least partially, of the focus state of an element, if it probably depends on the scroll position of the page? Probably this criteria partially discourages using a sticky element at all. Is that true?
So this question is about the focus not obscured criterion. So yeah, essentially there is some ambiguity actually in this success criterion. So essentially, when we are talking about that the element must not be fully obscured, it means that it still needs to be at least recognizable enough that the user can recognize it and see that there is a focus indicator around it. But it's actually really the gray area of sometimes how the WCAG rules are written that leave then technical people into interpretation. So essentially, this criterion not only apply to sticky banners, but for example, also when you have, for example, a panel in the middle of a dialogue panel that is placed in the middle of the page and may obscure partially a focused element underneath. So in this case, another way of fixing this problem would be to allow that this panel can be dismissed in order that the focused element is visible on the page. So essentially, the way we can measure this or decide whether an element is or is not sufficiently visible on the page is to try to verify it is recognizable enough that a user can understand what type of control is. So for example, if it is a link or if it is a button or if it is an input field. So that would be, from my point of view, the best way of saying if an even partially obscured element is still enough visible that user can sufficiently understand it and perceive it on the screen, and therefore understand that it's actually focused on the screen.
Okay, we have an e-commerce site. Which part of 2.2 will be the most challenging?
So probably if you have an e-commerce site, which probably has some sort of My Account involved, where users are supposed to log in order to see their order history, or I don't know, any other My Account features. So making the site conformant against the 3.3.8 authentication rule would be the most challenging. In particular, if your current site doesn't support, let's say, alternative methods of authentication, like sending magic links instead of asking user for entering a password, or implementing a two-factor authentication method. So this is probably the most challenging criterion, since it goes beyond just changing something in the design phase, but also restructuring some flows, and also from the back end of the site, it needs to, let's say, revisit some functionalities in order to make it compliant to this rule.
Okay, we've got a question about CAPTCHA, and then another question about passwords.
Yeah, so for the CAPTCHAs, I can bring up some questions. So, but essentially, an alternatives to the cognitive function task could be really, let's say, visible options displayed at the login, at the beginning of the login process. So, for example, it could be, let's say, presented the default login with the username field and the password field, and then you can add, for example, a simple text link that say, log in via by receiving an email, or maybe log in using a two-factor authentication method. So it's just simple as that. So it doesn't need to be visually that complicated from the presentation point of view. So there are a lot of other examples you can find online that already have implemented this type of presentation of multiple methods of logging in into a service.
And with that, this webinar is now ended.